Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar we're going to be having today for Urbanism Next on impacts of COVID around city. My name is Nico Larco. I'm the director of the Urbanism Next Center, and I am very excited to be doing this as a continuation of our series this year, launching with our virtual conference a couple months back. I'd like to thank our sponsors, NUMO, the American Planning Association, OPA Oregon, ASLA Oregon, AIA Regional Urban Design Committee, the Urban Land Institute and Urban Land Institute Northwest, and then a whole host of sponsors that we've got, Uber, Knight Foundation, Tool, Perkins and Will, Lyft, Eco Northwest, ODOT, Kittleson, Anchor Moyson, Methuen, Alta, Fair and Pierce, Parametrics, and Arab. We are very thankful for your support throughout the year in supporting the virtual conference and supporting our webinars throughout the year. Today, we've got a really exciting program for you. We just launched 2 reports. Hopefully you saw those this morning on COVID impacts. I'm going to be presenting on a lot of the material that's in there, and we have Jyot Chadha from NUMO, the Director of Alliance and Partnerships, we're going to be having a conversation after this presentation. And so with that, I'll go ahead and get started. As we all know, COVID-19 has been in our country for a good while now, and we are very much in this phase right now during reopening, and continues to bounce back and forth with that. At Urbanism Next, we've been looking at this more or less since the lockdown started, with a real focus not so much on the impacts of the lockdown itself, but trying to figure out what is going to be the longer term impacts and what the recovery new normal is going to be about. That research that we've been doing over the last 6 months is really summarized in the reports and is what we're going to be talking about today. At Urbanism Next, we do a lot of work looking at the major disruptions, forces of change that we've seen in cities. Historically, we've looked at new mobility, autonomous vehicles, e-commerce, and urban delivery, and we're really interested in what the impacts are going to be across all these different dimensions that really are critical for cities: land use, urban design, building design, transportation, and real estate, and then very interested in the implications of those things for equity, health, safety, and the environment, and the economy, and what to do about them. Well, as COVID took us, we realized that is just another disruption. And so what we've been looking at is how is it that this disruption is going to play through all these different areas within cities. As I mentioned, we just released these 2 reports, which we're going to be talking about today: COVID-19 impacts on cities and suburbs, key takeaways across multiple sectors, and then also impacts specifically on the different topics in the Urbanism Next framework. While I'm the one presenting on this today, it's been a fantastic collaborative effort with Grace, Amanda, Tiffany, and Matthew, all from Urbanism Next, and we're very excited to be sharing this work today. So getting into this, the first report really looks at what we're calling the primary COVID impacts, and we've organized them in terms of transportation, retail, restaurant type impacts, and economic impacts. And I'm going to go through some of these today. I'm not going to review all of them, and I'm not going to review all the material that's in the report because it's much too much, but we want to give you an overview of the types of things that we're looking at and the impacts that it's going to have overall. So starting out, we're going to do a little bit of a baseline of what we see happening now, and then we're going to shift to looking at the impacts across the framework. So as we think of work from home, there's been a tremendous growth of work from home. In June, a study done by Stanford found that 42% of the US labor force is working from home full-time, which is a tremendous shift from what we've seen in the past. Now, we should recognize, one, that this has tremendous impacts across transportation, across the places that we're spending time, and potentially longer term. We'll talk a little bit later on how much of this might stick around. Something that we have to talk about and that we're going to be touching upon throughout is in the report substantially, and we'll be talking about throughout today, is that not all of this is equitable, right? So not everyone can work from home, as we know. Essential workers, many low-wage jobs, people who have children at home make it very difficult to do this. If you have someone sick at home, if you don't have the right space. So even though we see a lot of the US labor force right now working from home, there are tremendous barriers that are not equal across the spectrum. The work from home has had tremendous impact on trips. This is a fantastic resource if you haven't seen this. This is Brookings Metro Recovery Index, where they have a update, I think, monthly data on how the COVID is impacting a bunch of different issues across cities. Here I've highlighted work trips, and you can see, minus 46% of work trips in some cities. across the country, just tremendous drop in the amount of travel that we're seeing there. And we're seeing reduced travel overall. I think this does not surprise anyone. This is from USDOT. Tremendous drop, 77% of where we were in pre-pandemic levels in terms of transportation. We saw the big drop right as the COVID hit. There was a little bit of a V-shaped recovery, we'll say, as the place started to open up, but we are back down, and it looks like we're probably going to be in this reduced state for a good amount of time. One of the bright spots, I think, of what's happening with COVID has been a great surge in cycling. Between 50 and 75% growth in cycling use in some cities. The interesting thing is that cities that have a whole lot of cycling already in them, for instance, Washington, D.C. and Portland, where I'm at, actually have not seen very much growth at all, or actually some drop, but it does point to places that have not historically had this. There's this like barrier to entry of being able to use cycling that has really shifted. And part of that has been infrastructure that's changed, and part of that is trying to figure out what's happening, how to get around based on transit impacts, which is also at tremendously low levels. This is data just from this week coming out of USDOT as well. And we're seeing 27% of transit use compared to pre-pandemic levels. Just tremendous drops all across the board. This is just looking at MTA, but you'll see this in systems across the country. This is having impacts not just on the number of people who are riding, but also the amount of service that's being provided, which, as we know, has a circular impact then on how many people are riding. Again, this is not an equitable impact of COVID. This is affecting people, lower income people and people of color much more than the population as a whole. So these are definitely issues that we need to be dealing with. TNC ridership has plummeted. We're right now at about 32% of where we were before COVID. With thankfully there's some growth happening again, but because of the concern of sharing rides and being with people that we don't know, that looks like it's going to be suppressed for a long time. So big questions on all the new trends in new mobility, how much of that will continue during the pandemic and then after. Similar with e-scooters, tremendous drop in the number of the amount of service that's available. So this is looking across docked bike share, dockless bike share, and e-scooters, and you see that there's a number of systems that closed permanently since things started in March, and a number of systems that suspended operations for a good amount of time. Now think about scooters in 2018, its first year had 38 million rides. In 2019, data from NACTO here, 88.5 million rides, right? So tremendous growth. This year, we're probably going to see a significant decline in this. So it's really shifting landscape of what's happening with new mobility across cities. Interest in e-commerce, increase in e-commerce has been tremendous. We've seen about a 30% increase of where we were. So this is the percent as e-commerce as a percent of total retail sales. And just we've accelerated more or less 5 years where we would have been with this continued kind of steady growth of e-commerce. And this is really important, one, because of all the impacts it has in terms of brick and mortar stores, all these types of things. But also it will have long-term impacts in terms of that we have gotten over a lot of barriers that we had to entry. So especially if you think about the grocery market, just tremendous growth in that area. And the big question is how much of this will stick afterwards. Tremendous. We've seen large growth of e-commerce. We've also seen an incredible growth of meal delivery and goods delivery. So here you can see, more than 100% increase of where we were before the pandemic. Again, this is a barrier to entry question here. We've gotten over, a lot of people have tried this for the first time, are using it more. Chances are those types of things will stick post-pandemic. Large closing and reduction of restaurants. The National Restaurant Association did a survey in July, and said they were already seeing more than 100,000 restaurants and bars permanently closed. Restaurants and bars are low margin, tremendously sensitive to disruptions, and winter is going to limit a lot of the outdoor dining that we've seen that's kept many of them afloat. So this number is most probably going to increase substantially. Also, reduced number of brick and mortar stores. So far this year, the latest numbers I've seen, 7,500 store closings this year. Last year, we had the most store closing ever in history, which was 9,300, and we're already at 7,500. Some people are projecting that could double by the end of the year. And here you see retail vacancies, just tremendous growth of retail vacancies in the second quarter, more than doubling what it was before that. This is going to have long-term impacts on land use, and it will have long-term impacts on real estate. Finally, small businesses closing. We're seeing this across the board. Again, this is from Brookings Metro Recovery Index, and you can see that the number of small businesses that are open and the number of businesses that are open that have reduced their hours is tremendous across country. So this is will have an impact on how much transportation we're seeing, the ability for growth and such. So in the second report, so if we think about these impacts that are happening across the board, and again, haven't gone through all of them. What we're then thinking about is like, what are the impacts going to be specifically on some of the topics that we look at on the Urbanism Next framework? And that's really what the second report is focused on. And we do that in two parts. First, we take each one of these pieces that we talked about, these COVID impacts, and we relate them back to these, what we've called in the Urbanism Next framework, the first order impacts. So for instance, change in parking demand, work from home, reduced overall travel is going to reduce the demand for parking, but then again, we have more people driving alone, we have reduced transit ridership and so on. So trying to get a sense of how some of the trends that we're seeing right now might have different impacts, not all in one direction on these core pieces. I'm not going to go through these right now, but I invite you to look at the report, and one of the pages has a graph like this, which helps you understand the impacts across all these different, the impacts on the first order, the effects on the first order impacts based on these trends. What the rest of that report does, and the rest of the time that we're speaking today, is talking about what the impacts are going to be across the entire Urbanism Next framework. So for those of you who haven't seen this, I invite you to go to urbanismnext.org and download this. What we looked at is this was based on initially impacts of new mobility, e-commerce, and autonomous vehicles, and how it's going to be affecting our cities, trying to get our arms around this topic to understand what the impacts are going to be across the sector and what the relationships are going to be across this. So what we've done is we've taken this very same framework and said, well, let's look at this disruptions from COVID and how are those pieces going to be affected. So this is the same framework. I've just made the text larger so all of you can see it here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through just some of the different areas and what we see as impacts happening across all these sectors. Again, I invite you to look at the report to make sure that you see all the different pieces. I'm only focusing on some based on time today. And I should also mention that there's the opportunity to ask questions through the question and answer button that's should be on the bottom of your screen. So in terms of land use, one of the biggest questions are how much land do we need for retail? How much land do we need for commercial and office space? Store closings, as I mentioned, are skyrocketing. This is not a new trend. So this is, and the issues that we've been having with land use in terms of retail space, this is not new. There's been a huge decline in the amount of retail space needed in the country. A lot of that due to e-commerce. We're just seeing a tremendous acceleration of that. So big questions on how much these areas are how much these types of buildings and these types of uses are going to stay used, filled, and how much more of this we need. So as land use planners, we really need to think about how much land we're designated for these uses. Same kind of question for office space. And that right now, we'll talk a little bit more when we get to the real estate section, is really a large question of what the impact's going to be. So far, there has not been tremendous amount of impacts across office space, mostly because of the way leases are structured. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But if the pandemic grinds on for a lot longer, we will see much more of those impacts. So yep, the same kind of question there with office. Warehousing, completely the opposite story. Warehousing has exploded during the time pandemic. Again, these are trends that we were already seeing with e-commerce. We have just accelerated with the acceleration of e-commerce. In 2019, e-commerce was about 12% of overall industrial leasing. So oftentimes warehouses are industrial areas. That's gone up to 20%, almost 21% already in 2020, right? Huge growth of e-commerce needs with warehousing. And where are these things happening? Well, all over the place. It's definitely going into industrial lands, but with a lot of the push to try to get faster response times, get us all the things that we order quicker. There's large pushes to put more and more warehouses in neighborhoods, and so this will have tremendous effects. One, that we need to think about how we zone for these things, how we allow these things, and two, we need to think about what the impacts are going to be on the built environment in those areas. A warehouse is not a very beautiful thing typically, and creates a lot of trips, whereas even a strip mall actually has some ability to like create interaction and be social places. In terms of our urban design, so moving on to urban design, one of the big things that we've been looking at in terms of the impacts of new mobility and AVs on cities has really been this potential push for more sprawl, the expansion of the metropolitan footprint. Large question with COVID that there's been a lot of ink spilled on this has been, is the fact that we're in COVID right now and that cities we can't be near each other, is this pushing people to go more and more spread out into the periphery and create more and more sprawl? The data right now shows that it doesn't, right? This is an analysis, very recent analysis from Zillow, where they were looking at listings and costs of the sale prices. And what they're seeing is very little difference between urban and suburban areas. The Northeast is this strange exception, which Zillow says mostly that these are for reasons that have to do with supply more than anything, but that you're seeing more or less, you're not seeing this enormous excess, except for in two main cities, which is San Francisco, and it's not on here, but New York. In these high-priced markets, very high-end market, highly priced markets, you're seeing a large number of people who are leaving those markets and going to surrounding areas, trying to get more space and get away from paying so much rent. So you're seeing paying so much for property. So you are seeing that drop. You're also seeing a slight drop in rents. So rents across the country in urban areas have gone down 2%. In urban areas, urban cores. In suburban areas, I can't remember the number right now, but it's something like 1.4% or something like that. So it was less. So you're seeing a little bit of differentiation there, but definitely in sales, you're not seeing much differentiation except for in those two, San Francisco and New York. So as of yet, I don't think, something that we think about a lot as urbanists is how much we're going to be seeing this tremendous sprawl. As of yet, we don't have to worry about that, which I think is good news for us. In terms of centers and corridors, this is a really large question that we've been looking at and what's going to continue to happen. The whole shift to work from home has kept us outside of these city centers and in our neighborhoods. And one of the questions is, if we continue with this post-COVID, if work from home continues, even at smaller rates, but if it continues, how much will we start to use instead of using our services and restaurants and such around and that now exist in central cities, how much we'll be using that and demanding that in our neighborhoods, right? So large shift to focus, which is already happening, accelerating again, trends that we were seeing before of interest in neighborhood centers. We could be seeing a whole lot more of that as I work from home, let's say next year, but I want to go get a coffee or run an errand. We might be wanting that near our neighborhood centers. What does that do to the desirability of places that have more developed neighborhood centers? The big question. Street design, we know, has been an enormous shift that's been happening around the country with COVID, in that the large realization that the streets aren't only for cars, and there's a whole lot of other things that we need streets to be doing right now. One of the biggest ones are these kind of eateries, these outdoor eateries, street dining streets. This is pictures from Boston. New York just, I think it was last week, extended their permitting to go through the winter months of allowing this and allowing for heating to happen there. So try and give restaurants an option, people an option to continue to be going to restaurants and doing it outdoors. So large change in how streets are working. And then, as I mentioned before, this big surge in what we're seeing with cycling. In this case, we've got an enormous number of bike lanes developed around the country. NACTA has been doing a great job. Up until the end of August, they were tracking the temporary bike actions that were going on in the US, 96 of them last count. So huge growth of the bicycle infrastructure, which will be a big impact on street design. Big question is, how much of that can we continue to have? And again, I think time is one of the big questions. In terms of building design, some shifts, definitely the slowing down of the shift in parking that we were thinking about with AVs and new mobility, as those things have stalled somewhat. A big issue is delivery management, right? So how is it that packages and goods that are delivered to residential areas are being managed in, large multifamily housing, but also even in single family housing. Just tremendous growth that we talked about that has been an issue for housing throughout the country is only being exacerbated right now. Looking at transportation, I talked about some of those things before. One of the big questions is going to be parking. Like, how much is parking demand going to shift? And as I mentioned, this is very much an unknown. On the one hand, reduced transit, the terrible numbers that we saw of the transit being impacted, more drive alone, those types of things are going to call for much more parking needs, right? If we're not using transit, if we're not using TNCs, if we're more driving alone, less carpooling, we're going to need more parking to be able to accommodate everyone. On the other hand, work from home, e-commerce, these types of things would reduce the demand for parking. So we'll see how these two things balance each other out. Vehicle ownership, one of the questions has been if we end up having this large reduction in transit, or if we continue with this large reduction of transit, will people all of a sudden need to buy many more cars to be able to get around? For many of us who are interested in issues of equity and health and the environment, this would be a detrimental direction for the country to be going in. Looking at car ownership, vehicle sales, over the last 5 years, you can see it's been fairly steady, hard hit during the pandemic at the beginning, started to rise up, but it's starting to plateau. So there's a question of if this will really happen. Obviously, there's a lot of things at play here, everything from the question of, do people absolutely need cars because it's the only way to get around if transit and other options, micromobility, TNCs, these types of things are diminished. On the other hand, the economy and people's ability to purchase new cars, right? So just the economic strength of families will have a large impact on this as well. Moving on to the last section of real estate, really large questions of what's going to happen here. On the one hand, very much related to the things that we were talking about with land use, if we need less, continue to need, and it seems that we're very much in that 20% vacancy rates that we were talking about for retail. If that continues, if there's less need for office space, if office space starts to go vacant, will that overall reduce land values, particularly within central cities? And if we really work from home tremendously, will that have an even longer or larger impact on land prices? That remains to be seen. On the retail side, it absolutely seems like this is going to be an issue. There should be listening to talking to some people in the real estate industry. Most of them said they would not put any money at all into commercial real estate right now. It is completely unknown what's going to happen. It looks like that is going to be underwater for quite a while. The next part is really project feasibility. How will project feasibility change based on this impact of COVID? And one of the largest things that we're seeing outside of the change in demand is a huge pulling back of capital into real estate markets. So this is from JLL just last month. Investment volumes reduced by 37% this year compared to last year. So many people are just keeping their money off the table in terms of any new real estate projects, and the continued uncertainty that we'll have with COVID will continue to have that effect, right? Actually, one of the things that we're seeing as well is this disconnect between bid and price. People who have the properties can want to sell properties for what they were seeing pre-pandemic. People who are bidding for the properties see a very different reality, and so there's this large disconnect, which is keeping a lot of deals from happening right now. In terms of buzz and vitality, there's one of the things that we're looking at with the impacts of e-commerce was, on the one hand, a large reduction already, pre-pandemic of the amount of activity that was happening in around retail, just because so much of that was moving online, and a big growth of experiential retail, right? So this trend we'd already been seeing for more than a decade, people wanting to actually have events happen as part of their retail. It's not just to purchase a commodity. We can do that with e-commerce, but we can have these events. Well, the pandemic has really put a huge pause on that, obviously, because experience is more or less what we're not allowed to have, or we can't have altogether. So that has been a large shift that we've seen there. So that's a brief view at all these different areas. Again, I invite you to look at the report to think about to look at the different sections. We go through all the different sections in the report. I just want to make the point again, and I've talked about it throughout the presentation today. COVID impacts are not equitable. This very much is a K-shaped event, right? There's some people in some sectors will do well and are doing well, but huge discrepancies and inequities in terms of people's ability to work from home, being exposed to the virus in general, but even things like street improvements, where these street improvements are happening, where neighborhood investment is happening, and the transit impacts, as I mentioned. These are all things that are not equal throughout for everyone. And so we really need to be considering how, I think in many of these numbers that I've given you, we're talking about overall trends, and the next level of analysis needs to be not just generally how the country is going, but breaking it up by different demographics. So one of the things we said in the title of this was that we would ask the question of what is going to stick. How much of this will stick around after the pandemic? And I love the words "after the pandemic." I hope we can get to that sooner than later. And I'll tell you, first of all, we don't have a crystal ball, so we're not going to tell you exactly what's going to stick, but we do have a sense of where we might head. So one of the things that we've been saying a whole lot to each other, and as we've been talking to people, is that just because you don't know everything about the future doesn't mean you don't know anything about the future. So we do understand we have some ideas about what might actually be impacting. We talked about some of this, our very first thoughts on this, when we were at the virtual conference earlier this year. But there's these variables that are really going to be just key deciding points in what sticks. And I want to go through a slightly longer list than what we had before as we thought more about this and seen some of the effects. One of the biggest one is simply the length of time that we're in the pandemic. If you all remember when we did the virtual conference, and we started the pandemic way back when, the big question was, is it going to be 6 or 8 weeks, right? And now we're talking about, is it going to be 2021 or 2022? The length of time this pandemic has tremendous impacts because it starts to solidify habits, right? Where we shop, what we shop for, the idea of working from home. This has turned into normal for many of us. There's been more and more tools that allow this. So large shifts that will have long-standing effects. We are getting situated in this new reality that it's become a new normal. Related to that, this question of these entry barriers that have been overcome. I use the example of e-commerce for groceries. Tremendous amount of growth in that sector, and a lot of it is simply people using it for the first time, right? One of the large barriers of entry is just people using it for the first time. And because of forced need and a little bit of a captive audience, those are the types of things that we've gotten over as a country. And so those will create categorical shifts because those barriers will not continue to exist once COVID goes away. Related to that as well is business model maturity. So I'll use the example again of e-commerce with groceries. When groceries first started out with the e-commerce, the shift to e-commerce with groceries as a pandemic started, it was messy, right? The places were not ready for the scale, and they didn't have their distribution channels completely worked out. It was not working very well. Well, that has shifted dramatically as they've had time now, 6 months, to figure out how to make that business model work and how to make that operating model work. The other big place that we're seeing shifts is in consolidations. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more of this. As I mentioned before, there was a number of those scooter companies that shut down. That is a really great opportunity for larger companies and deeper pockets to be purchasing those smaller companies and consolidating some of that market. In all honesty, with the new mobility sector, that might not have been a horrible thing to have happen, and we were already seeing some tea leaves of that happening, but this has definitely accelerated that. And it's very possible this lasts a long time. There will just be a few deep pocket companies that will be taking a whole lot of the business with this. Another piece of this that I think we really need to take a look at is large decision points. And this, I think, is as people who work in government, I think we really need to be paying attention to this, which is where is it that we make choices that will have long-standing effects past the pandemic? So for instance, decisions to buy a second car will have long-standing effects after the pandemic's over. If there's ways that we can kind of survive, and it might not be ideal, but make it through without buying that second car, that will be much different than if we buy the second car and once the pandemic's over, we have that. And people, it's been shown in a number of studies that if you have access to that second car, you will use it more. So we think about equity and health and environmental issues is a really big question. Another big one is obviously where you live. So if we continue on this for a long time and we do end up seeing large shifts of people where they've decided to buy a house, that will have long-standing impacts, obviously. Next really important variable is these timeline thresholds, we've called them. So things like, for instance, talking to a lot of people in commercial real estate, one of the ongoing themes that I've heard is that if what happens December 31st is critical. The commercial real estate market, you typically have a lease and you renew it for a year. Well, everyone more or less has renewed for a year. So that there hasn't been large effects in people terminating their leases for this. If come December, however, we look ahead and we don't see an end point to this, talked to a number of people who said that this will have a large impact on the entire market, because offices that have now spent, at that point will have spent 9 months paying for offices that they're not really using, will start to wonder about should they continue to do that, and will they need to shift those. So there are these kind of timeline thresholds that will be really important in deciding what sticks. One that I don't like to think about a lot, but is this continued fear of future pandemics. If in 5 years from now we look back and hopefully can laugh, I don't know if that's quite the word, but hopefully feel that, I remember that horrible pandemic that happened. Yeah, man, I'm glad we're done with that. That'd be great. And I think we will continue in a lot of the trends that we've talked about today. If we are looking at, thinking back to 2020 and the first wave of pandemic that we had, right? Now we're on our third. That will I think we will see tremendous shifts. Everything that we've talked about here, but just accentuated. It will be much harder. And then lastly, an enormous variable on what will stick are policy decisions, both at the Fed, state, and local, but Feds, I think, have the largest role in this. One of the things I'd point to are things like transit. Will it be a package that helps transit survive through this? If not, the impacts are going to be long-standing and I would say detrimental to many of our cities. Will it be government? Will it be aid to small businesses? Will it be aid to cities? Will it be aid to states? I think this will be a large variable in deciding what sticks. Obviously, we have election coming up. A lot more of that will hopefully be clear after the election. So that's more or less everything we're going to talk about in terms of the reports. I invite you to go to urbanismnext.org and visit the Nexus. As you know, this is a site that we launched right at the beginning of this year that looks at all the different technologies, AVs, new mobility, e-commerce, drones, a whole range of things. The impacts that those have across all these different sectors, implications for equity, health, the environment, and then what you can do about them. We have a whole section which is COVID-19 specific resource pages, which the reports that we just put out really focus on. And I'll also invite you to take a look at covidmobilityworks.org. This is a site that's compiled a whole lot of different actions happening around the world in response to COVID. This is a partnership that we have with World Economic Forum, NUMO, Polis, TNO, a whole group of people. So it's another great resource. And then finally, and obviously, we invite you to take a look, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on these two reports that we've just put out. As I mentioned before, the first one, the one on the left there, key takeaways across multiple sectors, really covers that first group of topics that I was discussing, and then the second report, impacts the Urbanism Next framework, really looks at that second part of the presentation I just gave. What are the impacts going to be specific on land use, on urban design, building design, transportation, and real estate? And with that, I will bring Jyot in so we can have a conversation about these topics, and we welcome your questions. As I mentioned before, there's the opportunity in the Q&A to be sharing your thoughts and questions. And I will stop sharing my screen. And great. Jyot, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Nico. Yes, my name is Jyot Chadha. I work with the New Urban Mobility Alliance, and just a quick background on NUMO for all of you that don't know us. We are an outgrowth of the shared mobility principles for livable cities, and I've put a link to that in the chat box. We are an alliance organization. We work with cities, with companies, and the representatives of people that live in cities to try to leverage this moment of urgency and disruption, really driving towards sustainable, just, and hopefully also joyful cities. Thanks for having me, Nico and Becky. First of all, I just say congratulations on these two excellent reports. I'd encourage everyone to read them. If 2 reports is too much, then I'd definitely say read the summary. It's an excellent primer, and I think it really should be a required reading for all urban decision makers today. So, so do take up that opportunity. So I'm in an enviable position of getting to ask Nico a few questions. I'm sure all of you have a ton, but we'll open it up for everyone else in a bit. But maybe I'll start, Nico, with a question on, give us a summary of what urban infrastructure or what models have sort of proven resilient in this in this pandemic, or maybe even if you want to approach it the other way around, what do you think has sort of been proven as extremely non-resilient?
And when you say infrastructure, like things that we see on the ground, things, okay. So I think, obviously the non-resilient has just been transit has been so impacted with this, and it is painful to see, here in Portland, looking at the buses go by without anyone in them, or very few people in them, and for very good reasons, right? We absolutely need to be safe with each other, but tremendous impacts as we think down the road to the impacts this is going to have on service, the offerings of what transit is, and the people who need it most, right? So huge inequities in that. Yeah. There's also been, I think this has been talked about a lot, so I don't want to discuss it too much, but the we can do it attitude of everything that's happened on streets, from everything from, as I mentioned before, letting businesses come out into the streets and take over some of that space, and then also creating bike infrastructure, things that for, literally decades, many of us have been fighting for those types of things, to think of the street as a place where many different things can happen, and yet oftentimes being car dominated. Quick changes, things that people thought were impossible and would have been political, just tremendously painful, happening overnight. And so a large question is, how much can we maintain these things? I'll tell you, early on in the pandemic, I was less hopeful that we'd be able to hold on to these things. I think just the amount of time that we have been in this, and the amount that we are getting used to those things, will keep them around for a long time.
I think that's really interesting. And I was sort of just reflecting on cities that have had the experience of either running pilots or repurposing space, and have the experience of working with different stakeholders around that, whether they've been able to, jump forward or found it easier to move forward in these uncertain times compared to cities that maybe don't have as robust an experience.
Yeah, well, and what you bring up, I think this is the direction that you might have been asking us. One of the difficulties, tremendous difficulties that we're seeing right now, is the whole idea of community engagement. It is just very, very hard. I'm not going to say community engagement was easy before this, and there are definitely a lot of issues, but just having people on the one hand being able to engage, like either having the technology, you know, getting the information of when these types of meetings are happening, those types of things. But on the other hand, also having the bandwidth to be able to engage, right, has really been challenging. So and with that bandwidth question is what issues are most important. If you know, I've got kids that you know, definitely has been a challenge to figure out how to make sure that they're accommodated in all this and can feel okay through this whole pandemic. I don't have young kids, but I imagine people who have young kids, it makes it tremendously hard to engage. And if someone asks me, what do you think about, you know, putting a new bike lane in, I think my first question is, how do I make it to like the end of the day? What, you know, what's going to happen with my job? Those types of things. So I think it's a real challenge for cities to figure out how it is that we can engage in this, both the logistics of engaging, but also making sure, you know, it's very possible it might make sense to compensate people for the time that they're spending in doing this, so make sure we can get a wide array of opinions.
Yeah. You talked about 42% of people right now in the US working from home, and that's an astonishing number. I think a number that a lot of transportation planners would have tried for before, and it happens for completely different reasons. How are you thinking about what that might mean in the long term in terms of the attractiveness for people to live in cities, to live in urban centers, for businesses to locate themselves in those places? And how do you think concepts like the 15-minute city work, given this potential sort of change in habits or change in what's attractive and unattractive? Or do you think that we're looking at potential for increased sprawl?
That is a great question. That is a great question. So yeah, the work from home is such an interesting question. Uh, Early on in the pandemic, I saw great work coming out from Patricia Mokhtarian on work from home that's happened in the past, right? How much that the events, you know, cataclysmic events, you know, hurricane comes through, people work from home for a month, and everyone's saying at the moment, oh, well, that will stick, and so therefore we should like think about this whole new world, and then by and large, mostly not sticking at all, right? Very much returning a couple months after any kind of large event, going back. I would say this is different. This is absolutely different for a couple of reasons. One, it's the scale. We are all doing this together at the same time, which I think it makes a tremendous difference, not only in just the group of people, but the willingness to engage over this, right? If we're all working in the office and then we'd have to have that meeting in some other place with someone coming in on Zoom, you know, that felt like a disruption. Whereas now it's a complete shift in how we think about that. The other thing is that we have a ton of tools that have been developed that existed. We'll say probably in a couple months. We'll say we're in tremendously crass states when we first started using all these tools in March, but it's just growing more and more. And that I think the facilitating these types of things, and I think we will carry those things with us. Yeah, so I think those will tend to continue the work from home trend. The really interesting thing, there's a fantastic piece came out from Vanderbilt University, the engineering department, that looked at, they modeled trends with traffic. They were looking mostly at travel times, and we're looking at the impact of they had four main impacts that we're looking at, but one of them was work from home. And they had a slider you could use to figure out how much of an impact this would be on travel. And the crazy thing is that if we stay with like, you know, 15 to 20% of people working from home, it has a tremendous impact on transportation, tremendous impact. So, you know, travel times go way down, traffic congestion goes way down, which really makes you think like, isn't this a strategy? Isn't this like a really viable strategy for any kind of, you know, demand management, you know, congestion relief, right? This might be something we really want to do. The last thing I'll say about that in terms of and then I want to talk about the 15-minute city, the possibility this will happen. I think companies, it will look very kind of quaint that we used to be able to draw from a talent pool, the companies that can work remotely, right? Not everyone, we need to be clear about that, but the people who can work from can work remotely, that our labor pool and like our talent pool was the people who happen to live in my city and could get to my office, right? So any company looks forward and says, I can grab that talent, but I can also grab all this talent from around the country and around the world, my sense is we're just going to be seeing more and more of that happening. In terms of the 15-minute city, I think that is a great question. I think we've already seen, as I mentioned, the last decade, we'd seen tons of growth and interest. If you look at the real estate sector, the idea of neighborhood centers, right? So not your, not just a kind of a strip mall type thing, but a place that had some quality to it and had some ability for social interaction, created some buzz. That is where a whole lot of people wanted to move. They didn't want the nameless sprawl. They wanted, even if they weren't going to the suburbs, they were going to these types of areas. And I think that this has only exacerbated that. So if you had a choice of where you want to live right now, and being close to downtown was no longer the main thing that you wanted to do, I think the idea is not to get out in the middle of the rural areas. Throughout history, we've seen people who didn't want to live in cities move to the edge of cities, not out to the middle of nowhere. But then trying to be near these neighborhood centers. Absolutely.
I think it's interesting for me just to see in my own neighborhood how work from home and how, I guess, changing patterns of commutes has really sort of shifted the mix of who's in a neighborhood during the daytime, and how it has the potential to perhaps like change or maybe even eliminate peak commuting times. But I wanted to shift the focus a little. You talked a bit at the end about how it is a K-shaped experience.
Phenomenon event, yeah.
Right now. And so how are you, I'm thinking about critical workers who are sort of struggling to get to work. And you talked about how transit is struggling right now from an economic, from a financial perspective. I'm also thinking about the huge job insecurity and the rising sort of unemployment numbers, and thinking in particular about folks who live in places that didn't have transit or don't have transit or have reduced hours of transit and have had to rely on a car. I think it's a really precarious situation right now, especially given how many people in the US own a car because of a car loan, and what is their ability to service that loan today, and what does that eventually lead to in terms of their being able to access their existing jobs or even new jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty straightforward, and I'm sure Numa, I know you've all done work on this as well, that getting around with your car, with a car, is an expensive way of moving, right? The sunk cost, the upfront cost to make that happen is tremendously expensive compared to a ton of different ways of moving. There's even studies that have happened, a couple of studies over the last few years, that have shown that TNCs are transportation network companies for Uber and Lyft, actually for something like 24% of the population right now, in the way that we travel, I should say pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, the way that we traveled, that was a more economical way of moving. If transit no longer exists for a lot of people, if these other new mobility options don't exist for other people, and your only option to move around in the things that we need every day, it's like recreational moving around, is to like survive and to go to my job, to get to the store, is a vehicle that puts a tremendous burden on a lot of people who don't have a tremendous amount of money to be able to do these things. I think that will have long-term effects. And the other piece that you talk about, which I think we are just seeing the beginning of that, which is with a very much faltering economy. I don't know exactly what unemployment's right now, but I think it's like 8 or 9%, right? We look at it and we say, it's great. It's only 8 or 9% compared to the near 20% that we were at before. I don't remember how high it had gone originally, right? But you look historically, that is not a sustainable for the country as a whole. So you're absolutely right. Things that questions of, will we be able to continue to pay rent, right? Will we be able to continue to put food on the table? Will we be able to pay for a car? Are really large questions, and that will have repercussions throughout. Expanding this beyond to look also at kind of the rent question, there's been a number of mandates to limit evictions, right? Which I think is a
Mhm.
very humanitarian thing to do in this condition. Eventually, those limiting evictions with people who cannot pay for their rent, and I'm sure similar things will be happening for car loans, puts a tremendous strain on the people who are lending that money, right? And who are not getting paid back and have lenders that they have. So there is absolutely a concern of cascading impacts of that. I think a number of people in the economic world have said the reaction the federal government had at first really saved us from much more detrimental effects than what we'd seen before in other recessions, depressions, definitely the Great Depression. But a question is that policy question, what are we going to do as we move forward?
Nico and Gio, thank you so much. My name is Becky Steckler, and I am the Urbanism Next Program Director. And I am going to ask you some questions from the audience. And so one of the first questions that we had was, do you think that the closing of brick and mortar stores could encourage increased urban density with fewer large suburban shopping centers? Or do you think that the increased work from home is going to lead to kind of greater urban sprawl?
I'll start, but Jod, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these things as well. This is all very much that we are we are working on this on the fly, right? Trying to figure these things out. So I would say that the closing of brick and mortar stores I don't think is going to encourage more urban density because it's not that those stores are closing and therefore people don't have things to go to. It's that they're closing because people are getting their supplies from another place, right? From e-commerce. So that big shift in the rise in e-commerce is replacing all those things. I would say that the biggest question for those areas that have large brick and mortar big box stores and all this is what happens when all those are vacant, right? Which has two really large implications. On the one hand, for the tax base, I know a number of smaller cities that we work with have gone pale as we've talked to them about some of the implications of e-commerce longer term in terms of reduced tax base for all of this. So I don't think that necessarily is going to be a push urban density. In terms of the work from home, if work from home continues, I'm not sure if I would call it urban sprawl. I think it will be if we think of the city as having this, peak of density and kind of coming down, my sense is we might just like lift the density everywhere a little bit, right? So especially around these kind of smaller centers. So the polycentric city, we might be seeing more and more of that because the smaller neighborhood center. And a big question, Judd alluded to this before, of how much of this do we need, right? Or how much of the work from home do we need to make those changes happen? I'll tell you, the neighborhood center that I live nearby here in Portland, Hollywood District, which is right near here, I cannot help but imagine that if we're in this, that we still have the similar amount of work from home, but hopefully with the pandemic gone, or even half of what we have right now, those areas will thrive like crazy because we will all be using them for all the errands and service that we have. Jod, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, thanks. My experience just in Washington, D.C. is seeing a lot of retail, a lot of restaurants shut down in what were previously business districts, with those offices shutting down. So I think, you raised a lot of those questions about what happens to that space. What we are seeing is sort of an increased desire for people to be outside, especially as the weather improves, and to engage in social activities. So I think, the point that you're making about the polycentric city, I think that's an important one, but we're still at a point where people might happily go back to their, old lives or the way we used to do things. And so, the question that you raised about habits and about how long, what is our recovery time, I think is really critical to thinking about these questions.
That's great. We've got a slightly different question. One person asked, given the massive drop in transit ridership, will we see an acceleration in the penetration of self-driving vehicles in major cities? So kind of any insights on how preemptively can we make sure that self-driving vehicles serve people who can't pay what the market demands? So how do we ensure equity in service of autonomous vehicles in the future?
All right, I'm going to take that as a two-part question. One is, will this affect the growth of AVs, and two, the equitable question. The equitable question, I'll tell you straight away, we need to be dealing with that right away. And we've said that in the past. It's a lot of work that we've done around those issues. We're working with a number of cities around the country with the Knight Foundation, looking at kind of making sure that AVs are equitably, there's equitable access to all of them in terms of just being able to use them, but also the costs, for instance, and where they're offered. We're doing work right now, actually, not related to the COVID work, but related to working with the American Association of Retired People, AARP, and RAND Corporation, looking at the impacts of AVs to older adults. And one of the things that has become absolutely clear is that completely understandably, this is not a slide on them at all, but the AV companies and TNCs, which I see as the model for AVs in the future, are focusing on the populations that are the most, that there's a business model around. And what this leaves is a tremendous number of people who are, I'm not even going to say hard to serve, but harder to serve, and then the people who are really hard to serve, which are completely outside of that picture. And so there is an absolute need, as we think about how the rollout of autonomous vehicles in cities, that we need to make sure, and I think government has a large role in this, to how it is that it serves everyone and not simply the people who are more easily fit into business models. In terms of will COVID accelerate AVs, I don't see that happening right now. There's been mostly because we still have barriers in terms of the technology for larger rollout as one. So, but I think those are, I'm always surprised at how quickly some of those things shift. And then the second part is that there is still this fear or distrust of shared spaces. And even though the AV is a space that is, with an AV, we don't have to have a driver in there, right? Eventually, that it's still a space that's shared. And my sense is that people will be reluctant to do that. I really fondly hope that this pandemic does not last so long that that the technology is really caught up and is able to do a lot of these things before the pandemic's over. So my hope is that we will not see an acceleration of these things within the pandemic time. Jyot, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you a lot. I want to point people to principle number 10 of the shared mobility principles, which talks about the need for shared AVs in dense urban areas. And I think, Nico, you talked quite a bit about the hesitation, the suspicion around shared vehicles. I think to add to what you're saying, I would also say, is this an opportunity right now for transit, given all the challenges that they're going through, to sort of be forced to rethink the role that they're playing in this sort of new mobility ecosystem, and whether we can reimagine transit as sort of that overarching platform or umbrella to be the mobility manager. So to recognize that there is need for mass transit, recognize that there is need for shared transport, and what are either the vehicular or way people engage with each other on shared transport, like how do we rethink those pieces, but really fitting into a larger transport network and ecosystem. I think that's an opportunity today. Change is never easy, but why waste a crisis? And I think that there's an opportunity today for that conversation.
I think you are absolutely right in that. I think that, one thing that's happened with COVID is the realization, both from the transit side, that they can't serve everywhere, especially for instance low occupancy or low utilization routes. But at the same time, the razor thin margins that exist in transportation, a lot of the new mobility companies have also realized that they can't survive through this as well. And so I think you're absolutely right. Figuring out how we collaborate to make sure that we're serving the largest number of people to help with quality of life and accessibility is absolutely a piece of this, important piece, and maybe even an opportunity here if we break down some barriers. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. I just want to say thank you to everyone. Remind you of a few things. The reports, Becky put the links into the chat. We also sent out the email blast, and you can also find them on urbanismnext.org. Please take a look at them, download them. The slides from this presentation we will be posting also online, as well as the recording itself. So if you want to watch this again, share it with friends, bring the family together, you'll be able to do that, and we'll have that up shortly. Thank you so much for participating in this, and we would love to be working for any of you working on these topics or needing to work on these topics with your cities or private sector. We would love to be working with you. This is, at Urbanism Next, we really focus on making sure that we're translating research into practice, and we'd love to see opportunities to be doing that with you. So thanks again, and we will see you at the next webinar.